Hi, my name is Stefan Poos. I live in Frankfurt. This is my city. Welcome here. And I am part of City to City Europe, and we are members of the Exponential Initiative and Network with the goal to plant multiplying churches in the cities of Europe. And today I'm going to talk to you about a topic that is really at my heart, and that is how can the gospel be the centerpiece and the main motivation and the everything driving principle in a church planting efforts that you may be part of. So how is that message from the cross of Jesus Christ, this centerpiece of our belief, how is that able to shape you and your ministry and your whole city? And I have 3 points that I want to make. First, it needs to be your treasure. Second, it needs to be your passion. And thirdly, it needs to be your vision. And instead of just standing in my office and giving you a talk of 20 minutes, which might be a little bit boring to you, I thought, let me take you on a tour through my city and show you some places and people that lived here. And we will walk through the city and make the 3 points. And I would like to take you with me. Let's go. So this is the first stop at our little tour here in Frankfurt about the gospel. And the first point I want to make here is that the gospel needs to be the real treasure of you and the church planting idea you have, or the church plant you're doing. We're here in the middle of Frankfurt. This is the main mall in Frankfurt. And behind me is the Katharinenkirche, the Catherine Church. And this is the church where in the early 16th century, the first Lutheran Reformation sermon was preached here in Frankfurt. And it was an age, the Reformation time, that today very often people, when they say, what is it that you want to see when you plant church? People sometimes say, well, it would be great if we could see something like that again. So a time where the gospel unfolds its power, for churches flourish, where the church attendance is not going down. But in the Reformation time of Martin Luther was something like that. Martin Luther, the reformer himself, actually came to Frankfurt one day. He was on his way on April 14th in 1521. He came to Frankfurt on his way to Worms, which he was supposed to stand in front of the German Kaiser and to give witness about everything. And then he said the famous sentence, "Here I stand." So he was here in Frankfurt, and Luther, I think, is a really amazing example why this is very important about the gospel. It is his quote that goes like this: "The true treasure of the church is the holy gospel of the grace of God." So the true treasure of the church is nothing else but the gospel. And I think that is something that we, especially as people who think about church planting, about multiplying churches in Europe, really need to keep at the core. We need to keep this main thing the main thing. And it is not, that doesn't go without saying. It's not natural that this happens. We have to keep the gospel at the center. It is something that very often is in danger. Because very often, and I was a church planter myself here in Frankfurt, so I know that, we think like, well, if we have that kind of method, or this program, or this kind of style, this concept, or this kind of person or leader, if we have that, then our church plant will work, or our church will flourish, or our Christian community will grow. So I think we have the danger of not putting the gospel in the core and having it as its true treasure. Sometimes we think if we have this program about evangelism, if we have that style of worship, if we have that concept of small group, if we have some kind of theology, very straight, or all these kind of things, then it will work. But I do believe in what Luther said, and that is that the gospel is the true treasure of what we're doing, of the church. So I think we need to be very focused on that. And I want to challenge you. What is it when someone asks you why you think your church plant or your church or the ministry that you're doing will flourish? What is it that you would answer? Why will it work? And if the answer is anything else but, well, it is the gospel, and the power and the principles that come from there, then I would say you're in danger. I think it needs to be the gospel. All these other things are very important. And if you look closely at Martin Luther, he was very strong in concepts. He designed a whole new kind of service. He translated the Bible. So he was very good at all these things. So they're not wrong, but they need to be in their place. And the gospel needs to be the treasure, the real core. It needs to be the one thing that we put our hope in. Or as Paul said in Romans 1, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God to save everyone who believes in it. It is the gospel that is the power of God. And I think the church, we can see that throughout church history, has sometimes forgotten that. And we need to rediscover that the gospel is the treasure. Make it your treasure in your life and in your church planting effort. So the second stop and person that I want to introduce you here in Frankfurt is, we're in the center of Frankfurt. This is the Römer, our main plaza. And the person who was here was another reformer. It was John Calvin. And he came here in 1540 something to debate with the city council in here. And he walked into the building to debate theology with them. And if you have read a little bit from Calvin, you know that Calvin was very big on we need to glorify with everything and everywhere, and out of a passionate heart. So this is something, it's my second point. The gospel needs to be your passion. The gospel needs to be your passion. A quote from Calvin, he said, "We shall seek to understand God with our mind, to be amazed by his glory. Then our hearts will be moved." And I think that is something very true. So he had a combination between the gospel needs to be clear in your mind so that it can really move your heart. So before the gospel can be your passion, it needs to be very clear to you. And that is something that I think is very important if we want to think about multiplying church plants in Europe. I think everyone who wants to go church planting needs to have a very, very clear understanding of the gospel. And to be honest, that is something hard to find. Or it's not very easy to find. It is at least something that I would never assume. Very often I meet people when we talk about church planting and I say that this is such a key point. And they say, well, the gospel, isn't that clear? Isn't that something that we already all know? So we don't need to talk about that. And I think it's the opposite. We actually need to talk about it and its clearness more than anything else. It is the clearness of the gospel that is important, because otherwise it will never move your heart. So is it actually clear? I don't know. It is one of my main assessment questions to every church planter that I work with. And when I meet them, one of the first questions of mine is, hey, what is the gospel? Can you explain it to me? Can you make it clear to me? What does the gospel actually mean? And very often people are, huh? That's an interesting question. It doesn't sound like a church planter question, but I think it's the main church planter question, if there's one. I think it's very important because very often the answers to this question are either foggy, so quite in the fog or not clear, or they're wrong. And I think that is something that Paul in the early first century, when he had his multiplying church planting movement all over Europe, he pushed that point more than anything else. He was very straight at the gospel needs to be clear. And he worried about it when it was foggy or even wrong. And he corrected that. He made that the main question. And I think that is important. So if you are considering to plant a church or to be part of a church plant or want to start one, initiate one, I think it's very important that the question about the gospel, all these questions around it are very important to you to answer them very clearly. Questions like, how does forgiveness actually work? What is actually grace? How does substitutional atonement really function? What happened on the cross? How does it really work that people who are God's enemies actually became his children? All these things, what is it about Jesus and the cross and forgiveness? What does it mean that he lived the perfect life for us and he died the death that we should have died? What does that mean? Can you dig into that and be very clear about it? I think it is very important, because only if it is clear to you, it will become your passion. It will become the one thing that you will love the most, because if you dig into the gospel with your mind, you will find nothing but beauty. The only thing that you will see is stuff that will amaze you. And that is what needs to happen. When it's clear to you, it will become beautiful to you. And that will move you. And that will be the power and the principle for you to plant a church that is multiplying in Europe. And I think that is very important, that this becomes your passion. That the gospel, because it's clear, is your main passion. That it is the one thing, if a conversation comes to that point, then your eyes really start to light up, you start to smile and you sit up and you're like, whoa. And people around you realize this is the point you want to really talk about with all your heart, the gospel. And then you can share it in all its clearness and apply it to everything in your life. I think as church planters, we're often in danger to have other things that we're very passionate about. Some concepts, some ideas, some models and things like that. But I think it's very important to have the gospel as that one thing. Be more passionate about the gospel than your soccer club, your spouse, maybe your kids, your city, your hobby, your holiday, whatever. Make the gospel the one thing that you're passionate about. And then there's something, and that is a very healthy foundation to actually be part of a church plant. Paul was all about this. He said that when he came to the Corinthians, he said to them, "For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified." So he made it the one point he was really clear and passionate about. And I think when you met Paul, you couldn't stand from not talking to the gospel with him. Make that your own principle. Make it your passion. So the third stop is vision. The gospel needs to be your vision. If you want to plant a multiplying church in Europe, you need to have the gospel as your vision. And I'm here in front of a church that used to be the church of a very famous guy named Philip Jacob Spener. And there's still a bronze here at the side of the church. Philip Jacob Spener was the main Protestant bishop in the city of Frankfurt in the late 17th century. And so he was responsible for the whole church in the city. And he wrote a book called Pia Desideria, where he basically describes Pia is your heart and Desideria is your desire. So he wrote down, it's a good read, he wrote down what is his desire from his heart. And in there he says, quote, "I desire to see a movement of the gospel in my city, Frankfurt." And for that, it was very important that the gospel was not just one little thing in his life, but it was the whole vision for him, for his life, his church, and his whole city. He was actually able to have the gospel as his vision when he looked at his city. So it was a little bit like if you put on your glasses of the gospel. I took those from my cameraman behind the camera. Probably I look weird with it, but what Philip Jacob Spener was able to do is he was able to put on the gospel as the vision, as the focus of his ministry, and he could see a whole different city. He was able to see a city through the gospels, through the lens of the gospel, a city that would be changed, would be renewed, a city where money would be handled differently, where people would live relationships differently, where society would be shaped through the gospel and grace, where the resources of the city would be used for the benefit of the people, where the mindset would not be how much can I get out of the city, but how can I help the city, all these things. He was able to see that, and that is what he described in his book, Pia Desideria. And behind that is an idea. That is the idea that if you have the vision, the gospel as the vision of your church plant, you don't understand the gospel as just a little thing at the beginning of your faith. So you don't think that the gospel is just the entrance door into your Christian life, but it is the whole room. Or it is not just the ABC of your life, of your life in faith, but it is the A to Z. Some people or some Christians would would frame the gospel as the message that you need to believe or to understand at the very beginning. But once you're through that, then you can basically leave it behind, turn to all the other fun stuff in Christian life. But I don't think that was the concept of Spener, and I actually don't think it is the biblical concept. I think the gospel needs to be the whole thing, not just the ABC, but the A to Z. Or to use another example, if you think about your church plant as a phone, the gospel should not just be one app that you use to build your church. It should be the whole system that runs it. So all the other apps, everything else that you do is deeply influenced and rooted in the gospel, and it shapes everything. That is what the vision of Philip Jacob Spener was. He wanted to see a movement of the gospel in his city. And through that, because of that, we believe today, if we want to see movements of the gospel in the cities of Europe, we do believe we need to plant churches that have the gospel as their vision. And not just as the ABC, but everything. We need to plant churches that have the gospel in its core. That is our Pia Desiderium. This is already the last stop at our little tour about the gospel, and I always try to connect that with some history in Frankfurt. Frankfurt actually has a great history. This was founded 800 AD by Charlemagne, and it was a beautiful medieval city. And the old inner city of Frankfurt, this is where we are here, used to be a really nice old structured place until 1944. In the big Second World War, there were 2 nights when the city of Frankfurt was bombed, and the whole inner city, which was all wooden structure, was totally burnt down. So there was nothing left between the main plaza and the cathedral. Everything that you see here was not there anymore. And but this is really the inner heart of the old city of Frankfurt. And what they did in the 1960s was they really put an enormously ugly concrete building here called, the architecture style is called brutalism. So you can imagine how it looked like. And it was really like, almost like you have replaced the heart of the city and put something really ugly there. And then in the 90s, they had to tear that down. And then the city in the last 10 years has rebuilt the inner city. So everything that you see here is quite new. And everybody now is happy to have the old inner city back. So have the heart of the city back. This is actually an interesting picture for me for what I think is sometimes the situation in church planting in Europe. So I think that the heart of what we do and who we are and what church planting should be all about should be the gospel, must be the gospel. And it was the heart of the church planting movement that Paul did in the first century in Europe. The gospel was in the heart, in the middle, in the center of all of that. But sometimes in church history, it gets replaced by something else, by a method, a program, a person, or something else, even wrong theology or something that is not helpful. But then what needs to happen is we need to take these things out and replace the gospel back into the center. The gospel needs to be in the inner core and heart of our church plants. And that will then lead to a church planting movement all over Europe that is multiplying. And I think this is my picture for what I want to encourage you. Have the gospel in the heart of your church plant, in the heart of your life, in the heart of everything you do. And then that church planting network and movement will become something that shapes your whole city. And I think that is what we are standing for when we talk about multiplying church plants in the cities of Europe. So thank you for joining me on my tour. The gospel needs to be your treasure, needs to be your passion, and it needs to be your vision. And let that then become the heart of your ministry, your life, and your church plant. Goodbye.